Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson, and the Nightlight is on for Thursday, March 28th, 2024. Good to be with you tonight. Hey, quick question. What does it mean to be Hispanic? What does it mean to be Middle Eastern? What is race and ethnicity? What are those things at all? The US Census Bureau has been grappling with this question as it revises the way we ask about those things. Today, they revealed the plan. I will show you the new plan, some arguments for and against, and a few other census findings you might not have heard about. Plus, I'm going to answer a few questions from what would have been this week's Ask Me Anything, which I had to postpone, but we'll get to some questions today anyway. Go to nightlightjoshua.com for all of my links, or email me, joshua@nightlightshow.com. Glad to have you with me today on the various social media channels, especially YouTube. Remember, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is Nightlight Joshua, to subscribe there and follow me online. Can also watch on Facebook, Twitch, or X, but would love to have you follow over on YouTube. Hello to everybody who is watching, including my lovely frequent flyers. Holly, hello. Happy Thursday to you as well. And Pam, hello, good to have you with us today. Dark Forever Clear, hello. Hope you're feeling better, Joshua. Yes, I am feeling better. I am not quite so cranky as I was yesterday. At least nothing has happened to make me cranky. Not yet. Susan, hello to you. Good to see you. Solange the First, hello as well. Shannon, hey there. I'm sorry that my video software says hand, pink, waving, instead of just showing that emoji, but whatever. Hello, I'm waving back to you as well. Good to see you. Remember, you can always put your questions and thoughts in the chat on YouTube, and I'll get to as many as I can. You can also comment on Facebook, Twitch, or X. Would prefer you to come over to YouTube because that's where the cool kids are. And that is where I would love to have you come follow the program. So thank you all for making time today. Thank you for being here. It is a nicer day than it was yesterday. Dark Forever Clear, I see. You were just on fire. Yes, I was. Boy, was I, and was ready to burn everything down with me because yesterday was a very cranky day. I don't really like to be that guy. I remember, when I was on MSNBC, I remember that there was, that's obviously a space where you're allowed to get into things that kind of rankle and that irk you and that tick you off. And I think because a lot of the people I worked with kind of deal in that a great deal, and cable news is very much about outrage and contentious issues. I didn't want to be that person on purpose, rather. I didn't want to be that person on purpose. I think yesterday, I wasn't above it, and there were some moments when I was on the air when I did get kind of pretty ticked, but I tried to keep it in a very anchorly vein. Now, because I'm doing something different, I guess I feel a little more latitude to do that, but I still don't like to be that guy. I know what it is to have a temper tantrum. I was 13 once, so I had plenty. But I try to be a little more level-headed than that, a little more thoughtful than that. And so I try not to be that dude. But today is not nearly that crazy or contentious. Today's actually, I found some things that are pretty cool. It's a very different show today. Won't be quite so pointed and harsh, a little bit more illuminating. And actually, I think much more positive than yesterday's program. I think yesterday's program was worthwhile, but today's is a little bit different. One of the things that we talked about on yesterday's show as it relates to Vladimir Putin and Russia and misinformation and disinformation is how much race is kind of the issue when it comes to setting us against one another. The ways we talk about race, the ways we think about race, define race, and get into those kinds of issues of race are the thing that at least our Russian adversaries have determined is the best way to set us at each other's throats. So the way we talk about race is super duper important. Plus, we are deep in conversations now about things like DEI initiatives. We just had a Supreme Court case that upended affirmative action or race-based admissions programs, rather, not affirmative action, but race-based admissions programs in colleges and universities across the country, focused on the University of North Carolina and Harvard, but affecting all universities, and they're still trying to figure that out. So race is not a settled issue. We also have a very hotly contested racial issue, and I know we don't look at it this way necessarily, but it is that, with the war in Israel, with the battle between two ethnic groups. And the way we talk about whether you are more concerned about Israelis or more concerned about Palestinians, or whether you care about both, or whether where your allegiances lie, that cuts at the heart of ethnicity, race, the lines that divide us and the lines that define us. So it still remains a very big issue. The conflict at the southern border, that has plenty to do with race and culture in a variety of ways. Not necessarily overt racism, but certainly about who belongs here and who doesn't. And we'd be lying if we said that there weren't some color lines there. So the more we can have thoughtful, meaningful, useful conversations about race and ethnicity in this country, the better it could be. I say could be, let's hope so, in moving these conversations along. To that end, it's worth knowing about something that we heard today from the Census Bureau. Don't know if you've been following this, but this is something that they announced today, and the official paperwork is going to get published in the Federal Register tomorrow. But the census is going to change for 2030 in the section where you define your race and your ethnicity. Have you heard about this? They're going to add new boxes for Middle Eastern or North African and for Latino, for Hispanic. I've been following, when it comes to the census, the reporting of Hansilo Wong, who is a correspondent from NPR News, who covers the census. He is pretty much, as far as I'm concerned, he's the preeminent guy to follow. So if you want to kind of keep an eye on these issues, I would follow Hansi on NPR. I think he's as authoritative a source as I think it gets. So the essence of this is as follows. Basically, there is a proposal that the Biden administration has approved that will give some new options for the way you can define your race and ethnicity on the census. And we'll get into the difference between race and ethnicity in a minute. So there's a new response option for Middle Eastern or North African, which is sometimes abbreviated MENA, and another Hispanic or Latino box. There'll be a reformatted question that will say, what is your race and or ethnicity? It'll be part of the same question. And you'll get 7 options. So you won't have that thing that says, what's your race? And then, are you Hispanic or not Hispanic? It's going to be more combined to deal with the ways that people actually define who they are. And we'll get more into that in just a sec. Also, the instructions will change to say, select all that apply. So if you cut across various different racial, cultural, social, and ethnic groups, the revision should make it easier to identify yourself on the census the way that you see yourself, rather than kind of fitting into these weird, uncomfortable, unshapely boxes that don't quite work. According to Hansilo Wong at NPR, this review process to think about whether or not to do this goes all the way back to 2014. This was 10 years in the making. The proposals were kicked up under the Obama administration to make this change. The Trump administration killed it. The Biden administration revived it. And now it's moving forward. And of course, census data is involved in everything that the federal government does. The drawing of voting districts, enforcing civil rights protections, policy making, allocating federal resources, and so on. Now, if you live in the US, or if you live in an area that is counted by the census, which is pretty much the whole country except for a few places, American Samoa, Guam, the Mariana Islands, and the US Virgin Islands are not counted by the census. But everywhere else, when the census comes back around in the year 2030, you will see these changes. Federal agencies who collect any kind of race or ethnicity data all have to conform to these standards. Under the rule change, which I'll show you in just a second, under the rule change, it requires every agency to submit to the Office of Management and Budget a plan by late September 2025 to show how they're going to conform to this, and then everyone's got to get everything in place by March of 2029. Why are they making these changes? Well, there's a couple of reasons. And if you are of Hispanic descent, or if you are Middle Eastern or North African, you already know how kind of difficult it is to define yourself the way you see yourself. And I am African American, non-Hispanic, so I have had a very different relationship with the census than people who are Hispanic or Latino and who are Middle Eastern and or North African. So I can only imagine how very difficult it could be to try to make these definitions fit for you. Let me show you what the file looks like, or what the box is going to look like in the model from the OMB. But I can only imagine how difficult and how uncomfortable it can have been at times to try to make yourself fit into a box that doesn't fit you. Here's what that new box is going to look like. At the top, it'll ask, what is your race and or ethnicity? Select all that apply and enter additional details in the spaces below. So if it doesn't still quite fit for you, you can write in more detail. Top option, and this may or may not be the order in which these options are listed, but at least in this model, top option is American Indian or Alaska Native. And it lists some examples: Navajo Nation, Blackfeet Tribe, Native Village of Barrow Inupiat Traditional Government, Nome Eskimo Community, Aztec, Maya, etc. And that's interesting because to be Aztec or Maya crosses over into what we would consider Hispanic or Latino. So, but there's also some overlap there. There's some differences there. I remember back when I was still a reporter in my native South Florida, I did a piece about trying to get people to do the census. And I remember in that piece, the specific portion of it that I was covering for the local station, WLRN, was about getting people to take the census who identify as Mayan. Because people who are Mayan may be from Central and South America, but they don't necessarily speak Spanish. They speak Mayan. So the difficulty in reaching out to them was kind of doubled because immigration status is an issue, language barrier is an issue, but at least here there's another space where they can actually indicate what they exactly are, provided that the outreach is properly there to say, hey, this is why you have to take the census. You know, this is how you indicate yourself. This is why you should stand up and be counted. So the fact that they include Maya, I found really fascinating, especially since you can kind of select that in addition to all the other options. Next option, Asian. The boxes they provide: Chinese, Vietnamese, Asian Indian, Filipino, Korean, Japanese. Obviously, there are other ethnicities and ethnic groups that are not included, nationalities, and you can write those in. So Pakistani, Hmong, Afghan, and on and on. However you identify yourself would give better data on how to code yourself. Next section, Black or African American. I find this super useful because it gives you the option to mark African American, but you can also mark Jamaican, Haitian, Nigerian, Ethiopian, Somali, or write in whatever applies to you. So if you are Trinidadian and Tobagonian, if you are Ghanaian, if you are Congolese, you can write that in as well. I know a number of people who, and I kind of learned this when I was in college, who are from the Caribbean, but do not consider themselves African American at all. They consider themselves they would consider themselves Black, but not African American because they're not from America. They are of African descent, but they don't consider themselves African American racially or even culturally. I went to college with a guy who is from the US Virgin Islands, and he was like, I don't consider myself African American from the Virgin Islands, which is a US territory. But he viewed his connection to Africa as different and worthy of defining of its own accord. Now, there are other issues baked into that we don't have time to get into right now, but it makes a difference in terms of being able to see people the way they see themselves. That's also been one of the issues with the data for these two groups who are being redefined in the census, and I'll show you a little more of that in a minute. Hispanic or Latino. Now remember, you can check as many boxes as apply to you. Hispanic or Latino, the categories that are provided are Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Salvadoran, Guatemalan. But you can write in whatever else may apply to you: Colombian, Honduran, Spaniard, whatever it is that you define yourself as, Panamanian, and so on. And then underneath that, Middle Eastern or North African, which would include the boxes that are provided, Lebanese, Syrian, Iranian, Iraqi, Egyptian, Israeli, and then you can write in beyond that. I like that the census included a box for, say, Kurdish people who are practically stateless people. You may remember when we were paying very close attention to Syria during the Trump administration and the fight against the Islamic State in Syria, which we weren't really buddies with Syria on, but we had a mutual enemy there. Turkey didn't like the Islamic State being there, and there were Kurdish militias in eastern Syria, kind of near the border with Turkey. Turkey and Syria share a north-south border. And there were Kurdish militias in that part of Syria further east from the capital, Damascus, which is much further west, who were fighting Islamic State militants there. But the Kurds were fighting there because they wanted a state of their own, which they would, a kind of a Kurdistan, basically. I don't know if that's the indigenous word they would use, but that's kind of what it's been called frequently. And they wanted their own sense of statehood. What I wonder is whether in the next census, how many people, kind of in a similar vein, would write Middle Eastern and then in the box underneath write Palestinian. Because we know about the fight for Palestinian statehood, and we know how that has been elevated with the war in Israel against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And so it makes me wonder how many people would write themselves in as being Palestinian, which is in a weird kind of it's recognized in a way, but also kind of unrecognizable because there is no nation state to attribute them to. There's no passport granting authority, as it were. Like you don't get a passport that says, the state of Palestine, the Republic of Palestine, or whatever. So that, I think, will be interesting to see on the census and super useful to know how many people, given all these options, would identify themselves as such, or whether they would identify themselves as Israeli. You can be a citizen of Israel and be of Palestinian descent. You could be both. Will they write both? Will they write either? This also, I think, shifts the mentality of a lot of Americans who view Israelis as lighter skinned and Palestinians as darker skinned. And so we presume that if you are Israeli, you are more or less white. That, I think, is another cultural line that needs to be erased and redrawn for a lot of people in our heads, that if you are fairer skinned, you're over there, and if you're darker skinned, you're over here. That's going to be interesting, to me anyway, in the census, to see how that shakes out. Further down in the list, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, which I should note is separate from the box for Asian. We have lumped in the past, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders all into one group, and there are plenty of people who identify in both of those groups. However, there are also plenty of people who don't. So now, in the census, those will be separated out. So you can identify as Native Hawaiian, Tongan, Samoan, Fijian, Chamorro, Marshallese, or any of the number of other Native Pacific Islander groups and tribes that are represented, Tahitian, Palauan, and on and on and on. I think that's also a smart shift, especially in an area like where I live, where you have so many people who are of various kinds of what we currently call AAPI descent. We have a very large Asian population in Las Vegas. We have an extremely large Hawaiian population here too. And I don't see why it makes sense to treat Hawaiians the same as Chinese people. Like those are two remarkably different groups. There's overlap, sure, but there's also real distinction. And I think that this change makes a lot more sense in my head, just culturally, to give people more nuance in how they identify. And then category list at the bottom is white, and you can mark English, Italian, German, Polish, Irish, Scottish, and so on. Now, what I'm wondering here is, and I don't know if the census has changed this standard, if you are born in, I don't know, maybe you're from, I'm making this up, Philly, right? You're from Philadelphia, and your background is Scots-Irish. What do you mark? Do you just mark white, or do you mark white and also check Irish and Scottish? Or is that for people who were born in Ireland and born in Scotland and now live in the United States? That's the question I have. That I'm not quite clear on. But that is a detail that I can investigate another day. So here, this is the list. This is, and this list could also change between now and the census. It could also be revised, but this has already gone through a long public review process and like 100 public meetings, the Census Bureau said. So this is what the list is going to look like, more or less, when you take the 2030 census. I find this kind of fascinating. I think this is sort of great. And clearly, just looking in the chat, I can see quite a few of you like this as well. Shannon P., I see your comment. Shannon P. writes on YouTube, wow, as someone who is so multiracial, I think I'm digging this. Good. I'm glad. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, being able to talk about yourself as you see yourself, and as a country being able to deal with all the complexity of that in a data set makes a lot more sense than trying to squeeze you into another box. And this has gotten real stupid over the years, depending on where you live. There are still big problems with data collection. I remember when I lived in San Francisco. Lord Jesus. Y'all ain't gonna believe this when I tell you this. Y'all ain't gonna believe it, but it's the truth. There was an independent news outlet called Bay Citizen that did some reporting about crime statistics in San Francisco. It's so nuts. One of the things they found is that at the time, and I believe SFPD has changed this, but at the time, y'all ain't gonna believe this. If you were arrested or you were the victim of a crime or whatever, and they had to do the demographic statistics on you, there were 3 headings they could put your race as: white, black, or Asian. That was it. They didn't have a data category for Hispanic. They didn't have a data category for Middle Eastern. They didn't have anything other than white, black, and Asian, which is dumb. And Bay Citizen did the reporting on it, and SFPD was like, yeah, we meant to fix that. And then they finally updated it. But this is why these data are so important. How can you, in a city that has such a significant, first of all, Asian population, not have granular data on what nationality you are? San Francisco, parts of the Bay Area are like 30 to 40% Asian or more. So if you live in Fremont, for example, which is on the southeastern end of San Francisco Bay, kind of nearer to San Jose, you probably live in an area that is heavily, heavily Indian. But if you live in Daly City, which is the next city south from San Francisco, like as soon as you cross the city line going south, like toward the airport, if you live in Daly City and you are Asian, you are very likely Filipino. There's a huge Filipino community in that area. So just to say Asian is kind of like, it's screwy. It's ridiculous. Plus, the Bay Area in various points was between 7 and 2% black. So the idea that you would even need that, if you would need more granularity, but you're not getting it. Blacks are probably more likely to be the victims of crimes and the perpetrators of crimes in some areas because of San Francisco's history with race and policing, but that's another conversation. But the idea that you wouldn't break it down more thoughtfully is just crazy cuckoo banana planet clown town. And I'm glad they finally fixed it. Holly, I see your comment on YouTube. Holly writes, I can see a potential culture shift in this, giving people an opportunity to have some pride in their identities beyond not white and feeling like just a number. Yes, very, very true. And I think that I found some comments on that, or some writing on that online, and I'll get to that in a moment. Solange the First, I see your question on YouTube. How far back do they want to go? Within 1 or 2 generations? That's a good question. I think, and Humanity, hello. I see that you asked kind of a similar question with regard to my example about being Scots-Irish, maybe for 1st and 2nd generation people from Scotland or Ireland. You know what? I'm sure there's an answer to that. I may just not know it, but I think the overall key is that people would identify on the census the way they see themselves. So if you identify, maybe because you are 1st or 2nd generation, as Irish, I get that, but I don't want to say to you that if you are 4th generation Irish, but you are all Irish on both sides of the family, if you can trace your family lineage right back to, County Galway, and you know exactly where in Ireland your family came from and how they lived and how they got to the US, and like if you can trace back that far, I'm not going to tell you not to identify as Irish. I would have especially because have you ever tried to tell a person who's Irish to calm down about being Irish? Unless you are Irish from Ireland, I don't think you should say that. So I don't know if I'm qualified to do that. By the way, there is a guy on Instagram named Garen Noon who is an Irish singer, and he is absolutely hilarious. He posts very funny videos, including one about being Irish and hearing Irish Americans go on and on and on when they visit Ireland about how Irish they are. I find that he can make that kind of joke, and I can laugh about it. I think it's fabulous. Let me show you a little bit more about this. By the way, these standards, they take a long time to revise. I found a report from the Congressional Research Service, again, one of my very favorite websites, about some of the history of all of this. This directive that is revising all of this federal data is called Statistical Policy Directive Number 15. You don't need to know that term. Just know that that's what it is that applies to not just the census, but all these other federal agencies as well who collect a variety of statistical data. This directive was originally developed in 1977, last revised in 1997. So it's been a long, long time since they have worked a new version of this. The 77 version established the basic categories: American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, and white. It also pulled out the ethnic categories: Hispanic origin, not of Hispanic origin. And that's the way it went for a long time. In 97, that's when they focused more on figuring out how people identify themselves. It brought some criticism in 1990 because it didn't really reflect the diversity of the country. And that's when Asian or Pacific Islander was broken into Asian and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander in the 1990 census. And then in 2023, the Office of Management and Budget said, hey, the country is diverse in different ways now. We need to figure out how to do that. They experimented with a couple different versions, had a number of working groups, lots of public meetings, and then they came to this version of what we're going to see on the census. So that's how we got to this point right now. It's easy if you look at the data to see why the current system does not work. There was a report that came out last year in March of 2023 about how Hispanics complete the census. And according to the Census Bureau, more than 43% of Hispanics either wrote nothing on the race section of the census in the 2020 census or selected some other race. And that began to put a little more fuel in the argument that maybe this needed to improve. Also, the percentage of Hispanics who report a race from 2010 to 2020 dropped very significantly. Back in 2010, more than 81% of Hispanics reported a single race. In 2020, it was like 58%. So the shift was very sharp and it was pretty quick. And I think if you talk to people who are Hispanic, they'll tell you like this doesn't make sense. Also, then a post-census report in terms of how good the census was showed that Hispanics were undercounted by almost 5%. That could be millions of people. So giving people a way to identify more clearly as how they see themselves is kind of material to getting the census right. If you look at how Hispanics identified in the 2020 census, or the 2021 American Community Survey, which is also done by the Census Bureau, it's less often, it's more frequent than every 10 years, and it can go in more detail. From that study, you've got 27.6 million people who would identify as Hispanic and would identify as two or more races. 22 million said some other race. About 10 million said white. You've also got 1.4 million who said American Indian or Alaskan Native. About 900,000 who put Black. About 300,000 who put Asian. And so that's why there's that variety. That's also why there's a variety in terms of how we define race and ethnicity, right? You can be Panamanian and look my exact skin tone. So many people who are of Panamanian descent, and I went to high school with a girl like this, identify as black. But to be Panamanian, you might speak Spanish, and so you're Hispanic as well. And so there's all of this cultural overlap in terms of the way people identify racially and ethnically. One of the other things that's interesting is the history of how this has played out on the census form and why this whole push about where to put yourself as a Hispanic or Latino person has emerged. Code Switch, which is NPR's coverage team that covers issues of race and culture, did a piece back, 10 years ago now, about this line between Hispanic and white. They spoke to a sociologist named Julie Dowling from the University of Illinois, who had written a book about this. She is the daughter of a Mexican-American mother and an Irish-American father, so she kind of gets this in a very visceral way. The history of this I found really interesting. Listen to this. Back in 1930, census puts Mexican on the questionnaire as a race. Now you tell me, how you gonna feel? Some white man comes to your house and is like, do you identify as Mexican? And you're like, no, I'm Cuban. And he writes, okay, great, Mexican. They'd never find his body. Like, what? Okay. If you think that's cool, I guess I good luck getting home. So 1930, they put Mexican on as a race. Now, the key during the Depression, when the government was rounding up people, racial politics were very different. And that's the other thing about the census that I think the Census Bureau has reckoned with over time, is that the data have been a reflection of the politics of the time. In the 1940s, they used the census to find Japanese Americans to put in internment camps. Because remember, census is taken in 1940. Japan bombs Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So they have data. And this is why it is a legitimate concern, I think, of some people to say, I don't want to fill out the census because I don't want the government nosing around in my life. Well, they're not going to use that data. They already did. I think that's reasonable. Now, is it likely today? Is it as probable? I doubt that. But that's under this current administration. Who knows if there's a change in leadership, a change in policy, who knows what the future might hold and how those data might be used. The laws are also different on using census data, but it depends on a lot of other factors. Here's where it also gets interesting. Back to Julie Dowling, the expert who spoke to Code Switch. Back in 1929, you had a group called LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which is a Mexican-American advocacy group that formed in Corpus Christi, Texas. One of their big organizing efforts was to get Mexican removed from the census as a race. But their protest was that we are white. We are Americans. White. Now, before you jump up and down, I kind of understand that. Because in the 30s, in the 1920s and 30s, to be white was to be the type of American that Americans considered American, right? You couldn't align with black folks. Skin tones were too different, cultures were too different, languages were too different. We couldn't vote, we couldn't do a lot of things. So if you want to be enfranchised, you have to kind of align yourself with white. It's almost like in the early days of, not in the early days of the movement, but a little bit later in the LGBT rights movement, we were like, we're just like you. We're Americans. Very different from the first incarnation, which is we're here, we're queer, get used to it. But I can understand in the fight for enfranchisement, saying we're just like you kind of makes sense. Now, on top of that, the Mexican government didn't like the category because the Southwest used to be part of Mexico. The U.S. took it over, promised Mexico, then Mexican residents would be treated as full citizens, but you had to be white to be a citizen. That's why that whole thing got spun up. It was about being able to be treated like an actual, honest-to-God citizen. Problem with that is, if you claimed you were being segregated or discriminated against, the offending parties could say, well, wait a minute, aren't you white? See how insidious it is? See how powerful those lines are? I find this fascinating. This history of groups claiming whiteness, claiming majority status, claiming straightness, claiming we're just like you as a way of enfranchisement, and it backfires. that I would watch every episode of this show. I find this absolutely fascinating, this link between Americanness and whiteness. So, LULAC and the Mexican government, they get Mexican removed from the questionnaire. And then after that, there was never another Latino group listed as a race. The Hispanic origin question emerged in 1970 on the census long form, which goes out to a sample of households, which is about 1 in 6 households. In 1980, the Hispanic identity question ends up on all of the forms. One of the things they did do, it used to be they would ask you for your race. Are you white? Are you black? Are you Asian? And then under that, they would ask, are you Hispanic? And people would just skip the question. They're like, I just answered this. Why are you asking me twice? So they moved it up so that, are you Hispanic? You're asked that first. And then they would ask you, are you white or are you black? And doing that, again, allows people to say that they are multiple things, that they are, Afro-Latino or white. And, possibly if you are Latino and brown, you might also identify as black. So it gives people a lot more nuance in kind of how they present themselves. And I find that super, super duper fascinating. Mercedes, I see your comment on YouTube. Mercedes writes, the book Latino Land by Maria Arana deals with this exact subject. Ooh, interesting. Okay, Latino Land by Maria. For those of you who may be listening to the podcast, the last name is A-R-A-N as in Nancy, A-R-A-N-A. Maria Arana. The book is called Latino Land. In fact, I'm gonna look it up right now. Amazon, Latino Land, Maria Arana. Just curious. Let's see. Here it is. Latino Land, a portrait of America's largest and least understood minority by Marie Arana. I beg your pardon. M-A-R-I-E-A-R-A-N-A. Ooh, it's a new book. Just came out this February. February 20th, 2024. A sweeping yet personal overview of the Latino population of America drawn from hundreds of interviews and prodigious research that emphasizes the diversity and little-known history of our largest and fastest-growing minority. Latino Land by Marie Arana. That is interesting. I might want to check that book out. Thank you, Mercedes, for sharing that. That sounds like a cool topic. But anyway, this is why. Look, I cannot relate to what it is like to be Latino in America. I grew up in South Florida. I grew up around a huge diaspora of people, but I'm not going to pretend to know your life or who you are for yourself. I think it's nice that I don't have to pretend anymore, that I can just let you answer that question for yourself and hopefully answer it in rigorous enough detail that it's meaningful, not just to me as an observer or as an American, but to you as an American, that we call you what you call yourself. I kind of can't think of anything more American than that. But that's only half the story. Remember, I also said there's that other category, Middle Eastern and North African. I want to get into some of the rationale behind that as well when we come back. There are also a few counter arguments against this change to the US Census. I'm not sure I buy all of them. One of them I do think might be kind of compelling. One of them I think is weak, but I'll share them with you. I'll let you see what you think they are. Also, there is an image that was released, and I find it absolutely fascinating. Sorry to those of you listening on the podcast. You'll have to go online to see it for yourself. But I'm going to put it up on the screen. Again, sorry to the audio-only listeners. Can you tell what this is? Look at it closely. I know it just looks like a swirl of light, and it kind of is. But this swirl of light has taught us something very interesting. I will tell you what you're looking at when we come back. This is The Nightlight. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you for being with me on this Thursday. Remember to go to nightlightjoshua.com for all of my social media links. You can also find the link to the podcast where you can listen or watch on demand. This show is available as a video podcast on Spotify. And if you're not used to listening to a video podcast, don't worry, the Spotify app will allow you to just listen to it as audio only. But until people get used to that, I'm posting the audio and the video, so that's why every episode shows up twice. You can also go to my Substack for more of my original essays and articles. I recently wrote a piece about the upcoming movie Civil War, which depicts a fictitious civil war in the United States in the not at all distant future, and what I think might be a gigantic plot hole in that movie. I also wrote a piece about NBC News' decision to terminate Ronna Romney McDaniel, the former chair of the Republican National Committee, as an NBC News contributor. I think it made the right decision, but did it the wrong way. So that is also there. You can also go to the merch store where you can get Nightlight logo merch, including the Gullible Ain't Sexy t-shirt. Use an online tip jar where you can drop a few dollars in to show your support for the show. You can always contact me with your questions or thoughts or comments, critiques, or ideas. And of course, you can email me, joshua@nightlightshow.com. You'll find all of those things online. I would love, 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 love to hear from you as well. By the way, I appreciate those of you who sent in questions for the Ask Me Anything that was supposed to be this week. I ended up postponing the AMA because I was working on the piece about Ronna Romney McDaniel. I'm sorry I had to do that, but I just felt like it was a moment that I could speak to very specifically, and so I wanted to jump in on that. By the way, if you are watching on YouTube or on any other site, please remember to follow me. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is at Nightlight Joshua. Hit the like button if you're enjoying this live stream. Be sure to subscribe. Click the notification bell so you'll know when new videos are posted. I do post a number of segments as standalone videos, and sometimes I also do live streams just randomly, just for the heck of it. So be sure to like and subscribe here on YouTube at Nightlight Joshua. I did want to also, because there was an AMA, before we go back to the census, get to some of the questions that you asked. There were a couple good questions that I thought were really worth throwing in the AMA that I did not get to. And I will do two of them tonight. I'll do one now, and then I'll do one a little bit later. Let me get to a question, and then we'll talk about the rest of the census. From Rich, who asked, I know you've sometimes talked about your former employers, but I don't remember you making any direct comparisons between NPR and MSNBC. Would you be willing to talk about it? I hope so. All the best and belated birthday wishes, Rich. Well, Rich, thank you very much for that, and thank you for the birthday wishes. I keep saying witches. The birthday wishes. No, wishes. I am 44, by the way. That's the birthday I just turned on Friday. Comparisons between NPR and MSNBC, they're quite different organizations. First of all, I did not work for NPR. I worked on NPR at a member station. When I hosted the show 1A, it's based at WAMU Public Radio in Washington, which is part of American University. So we produced the show, and NPR distributed the show. It was the legacy of another program called The Diane Rehm Show, which was also from WAMU, which started as a local show and then became national, and NPR distributed that for 37 years with Diane Rehm as the host, and then I was brought in to help create the new program and host that. So that's what I did on NPR. So it was a very different structure than MSNBC, and it also, obviously, much more decentralized than MSNBC. Politically, the times were also very, very different. The news was a hugely important commodity because Donald Trump had just become the president, and NPR listeners were kind of freaking out. Not just because NPR listeners lean progressive. They generally do, but there are also a lot of moderates who listen to NPR. Plenty of conservatives who listen to NPR too and love it. Not like hate listening the way that like liberals watch Fox. Like that's not like that, but people who actually enjoy NPR. And so our relationship with the public was way different than our relationship when I was on MSNBC. Also, I got to MSNBC 1 month before COVID. So that changed everything. MSNBC and NPR have very similar audiences in one key regard. And this is something I think that for all the flapping that Fox News does about most watched, most powerful name in news, they don't like to talk about this. Fox News does have more viewers at any given time than MSNBC generally, although that's been shifting in the last 6 months or so. There have been a few hours at MSNBC where they've actually beaten Fox News. I think also because of the concern over Donald Trump. And CNN is just they're in a hole right now. We don't know what's going to happen to CNN. Ratings-wise, they're in a real weird place. They're making money, but the ratings are bad. One thing that Fox News does not have that both MSNBC and NPR do are listeners and viewers who will watch for very long periods of time. People tend, who love NPR, to turn it on and leave it on. Same with MSNBC. And so even though Fox had significantly more viewers than we did, we had viewers who were vastly more loyal than Fox News viewers were. And it's not that Fox News viewers aren't loyal to that network. They would often stay in that Fox News rabbit hole for very long periods of time. But the way that people watch Fox and the way that people watch MSNBC are vastly different. And MSNBC's audience is, I contend, way more valuable for that reason, especially now that so many regular advertisers consider Fox to be too toxic to advertise on. That's why you see so many MyPillow ads and so many ads with Mike Huckabee in them, as opposed to MSNBC, which has every blue chip advertiser in the country. And I think if MSNBC was smart, they would market themselves that way. You know, that Fox has a bigger audience, we have a better audience. And just leave it that way and make Fox prove you wrong. MSNBC, like NPR, is full of very smart, extremely studious people who are passionate about what they do. They take it personally when things are not done right. They put their hearts into their work. Sometimes they put maybe a little too much of their hearts in their work. It can really grind you down. But it's a good group of people. It's a real good group of people. Number one question I always got asked at MSNBC, what's Rachel like? Is she nice? I hear Rachel's nice. Is Rachel nice? I have encountered Rachel Maddow once on set, the night of the New Hampshire primary, right after I got to MSNBC. She was lovely. Everyone was lovely. They're a very tight-knit group, and they treat you like family and treat you like a guest, and you sit down at the table. You're part of the team. It was a really good place to be. It was weird when COVID hollowed the place out, but because many people were working from home. I was working from 30 Rock because I had just moved there, so I didn't really have a home yet to put a home cam in. But it was a good group. I liked MSNBC a lot. It is amazing being in that place. I think NPR feels different because it's not so associated with its headquarters, right? 1111 North Capitol Street, if you ever get to go to NPR's headquarters, is a formidable building. It's really cool, very modern. But 30 Rock is 30 Rock. And so walking into that place every day kind of put me on my mettle in a different way than walking into WAMU. Nothing against WAMU, but it's an office building with studios. Great people there too. I was also in a very different place emotionally when I was in DC versus when I was in New York. DC was very hard for me emotionally. New York was very different. And it was a lot more turnover and change and shifting shifts and programs and different networks. So it felt very different. But they were both really good places to be. I learned an amazing amount about being a journalist, about being a broadcaster, about being an interviewer, and about myself through both of those environments. I think both of them are going to survive the changes that are coming in media. I don't know what form they're going to take, but I think the brands of those two institutions are so unique, they are going to survive somehow. I think there's something MSNBC does that you don't really get anywhere else. And there's something NPR does that you don't get anywhere else. They both need modernizing. I think they both need evolving. I tried to loosen them up a little bit when I was there. And I don't know how much I succeeded. I do think that both of them need to not sound quite so stentorian all the time. I think you can be serious without being grim. And I try never to be grim unless the news is truly grim. And then I would rather be comforting and reassuring than grim. And I think sometimes they just don't quite know how to do that. But both awesome organizations. I am very proud to have worked at each of them. And yeah, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the chance to have done that. Let me get to your comments before we go back to talking about the census. Shannon P. on YouTube, I have NPR on most mornings from toothbrushing to almost lunchtime. Exactly. That's the thing. People leave Fox on, but they don't watch it deeply the way that people listen to NPR or watch MSNBC. It's very different. At least those are the stats that were there when I was there. That may have changed since I left, but that was kind of the fact when I was there. Holly on YouTube asks, have you seen the new animated sitcom about a public radio show? I think it's on Peacock. It is on Peacock. Yes, Holly, it's called In the Know. Yes, thank you for the title. It is on Peacock. I do know about it. I just haven't gotten around to watching it. I don't know why I haven't gotten around to watching it yet, but I haven't quite gotten around to watching it yet. I probably will. I probably should. But I'm sure I'll enjoy it. That old parody in Parks and Rec where Dan Castellaneta would play a public radio host. Welcome to Thoughts for Your Thoughts. I'm Derry Merbles. That was a great public radio parody because that guy exists in a lot of stations. So many markets have that person who's just been there forever and ever. When I was in San Francisco, it was Michael Krasny on Forum. When I was in Miami, it was Joseph Cooper on Topical Currents. LA has Larry Mantle hosting Air Talk. New York has Brian Lehrer and Leonard Lopate, who hosts the Brian Lehrer Show. WHYY Philadelphia, until recently, had Marty Moss Cohen and Terry Gross, but Marty Moss Cohen did the local show. You've got WGBH. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but it's killing me. They host a show called Boston Public Radio. They've been there forever. So every market has that person. So they know the imitation is apt. They know who they are. I'm sure it'll be fun. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. And Dark Forever Clear, and then I'll get back to the census. Dark Forever Clear writes on YouTube, when I was rewatching the live show late last night while transplanting seedlings, I had a thought. You should work as a consultant for the networks and get everyone set on the right track. Shannon also mentioned Kojo Namdi as a DC treasure. Damn right. I love Kojo. He was one of the loveliest people I worked with at WAMU. As far as being a consultant, I don't know if they'd listen. I don't think they're prepared for the level of change and self-examination that I would demand. I just don't think they'd be willing to listen that hard. I would probably make them crazy because I would ask them if the service they provide is good enough, right? It's great that we are on every platform, that we're reachable everywhere, but are we worth reaching out to? Are we something that people brag about? Yes, everyone wants listeners and viewers and readers. I want fans. If I was at CNN, my first question would be, who are our fans? Who loves CNN? Because let me tell you, people love NPR. They love MSNBC. Who loves CNN? That's what's wrong with the network. It's not that Republicans think that CNN's in the tank for Democrats. It's not that young people are moving away to social media. The problem is that CNN doesn't have an army of fans that will go to bat for it to help deal with these problems and more. That's the actual issue. Who are your fans? How do we acknowledge them? How do we identify them? How do we connect them? How do we empower them to go talk about us to other people and help us defend ourselves? And then how do we use that knowledge to create more fans of what it is that we do? I know that sounds like a weird way to think about news, but these are weird times. And I think it's a fair question. We don't have fans. We don't have supporters. We don't have an army of people saying, no, you deserve to exist. So if no one's saying it, why do we deserve to exist? How do we substantiate it to the world? I don't think they're ready to answer that question. But they're going to have to. Let's talk about the census. We mentioned people who identify as Hispanic or Latino. The other piece of the revision is people who identify as Middle Eastern or North African. Again, the US Census announced they're going to change the way that the form is structured in terms of how it asks about people's race and ethnicities, allowing them to select all that apply, write in more details, and also re-clarifying those two categories, Hispanic or Latino and Middle Eastern or North African. From the last set of census data that came out, we've got a kind of picture of who this group is in the country. I saw a report from September 2023 showing that the U.S. had, by that estimate, 3.5 million people who identified as Middle Eastern or North African. It also noted that the fastest growing Hispanic group in the last decade were Venezuelans. and that the two largest Asian groups are Chinese and Asian Indian, or Indian, people of the descent from India. This was one of the big detailed data drops about race and ethnicity from the 2020 census. And I'm glad the article mentions this. We're talking about how the federal government distributes $2.8 trillion of funding every year. That's $2.8 million. That's what's at stake when you don't fill out the census. That's what's at stake. If you're wondering, where's the support? Where's the federal government? Why aren't they paying attention? Did you do the census? Well, then shut up. That's why. That's why it's not there. Between being able to advocate for what you want and being able to prove that there are people where you live who need that thing, that's why the census matters. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. Plenty of pieces I found show lots of people who are delighted with this effort to more accurately and thoroughly paint a picture of people who are Middle Eastern and North African. One piece I found from Al Jazeera spoke to a man named Abed Ayoub, who is the executive director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, called it a first step, said it was a long time in coming. Mr. Ayoub said, quote, "Before, we were completely ignored. We had no category. The conversation moving forward will be, how do we refine this category, revise this category over the years to ensure that it is a representative and fair category," unquote. Yeah, I think that's pretty much the job. This is the first version of this. You know it's not necessarily going to be the last one, particularly because we know that people who are in this category have really gone through it in terms of trying to figure out how they identify. The New York Times did a beautiful bit of data journalism that was graphically very, very rich, talking to people of Middle Eastern and North African descent who are often just counted as white by the census, but who don't really identify that way. So the Times spoke to more than 5,300 people in the US who are of these backgrounds to ask them how they describe themselves. And it is an amazing tapestry of different kinds of identifications and terms that we may not often hear. Cypriot, half Persian, Semitic, Yemeni, Caucasian, Israeli, Arab, Sudanese Arab, Coptic Egyptian, Levantine, Assyrian, American Arab, Kurdish, multiracial, Bedouin, Levantine Arab, and then beyond that, misunderstood, complicated. So many ways to identify. And this is why I think this is so important. One of the voices that they mentioned in the piece, Samira Hadi, who identifies as a Yemeni American, she said, quote, "The categories don't speak to my identity as Arab, or more specifically, Yemeniya. I don't walk through this world as a white person. I don't get those privileges as a white person. I don't have white culture," unquote. I think what she said is kind of the key to all of this. It's not just about race, because race is about privilege. It's about identifying who can speak, at least partly. It's partly about identifying who can speak to the privileges that are conferred upon people of different racial backgrounds. Because we know there are correlations there, legacy correlations. And if we can make those connections, we can A, see the correlations, and B, see them change, hopefully see them improve. But if we don't have the data, we can't really do much that's actually defensible or effective. Another person who is mentioned in the piece, Amini Saeed Kouidiri, 48 years old, identifies as Nigerian and North African, said, quote, "I am African, but I feel that checking the Black or African American box is wrong. My ancestors did not struggle through slavery or racism. My skin color does not make me a target of racism, but I'm not white," unquote. Fascinating. I think the array of different answers that different people gave is just so useful. Now, in the Times survey, they asked people a bunch of questions to get at their racial and ethnic identity. They were asked to choose from a list of options that did not include Middle Eastern or North African. So nearly half of those people chose another race, about 49%. About a third chose white. When they did add a box for Middle Eastern or North African, it totally flipped. 69% of people chose that category, and only 15% chose white. Remarkable, the difference. When you give people a way to identify that meets their need, they'll take it, and they will show you what that identity means to them. Another person they mentioned, Dusty Haddad, is 51, who identifies as Palestinian. Dusty said, quote, "I have been discriminated against and been told to go back to my country more times than I can count from white people. Why should I be lumped in with the very people who discriminate against me?" Unquote. Good point. Another one, Khalil Bouarouge, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Khalil Bouarouge, who's 37, identifies as North African. He said, quote, "I'm not white, I'm North African. By having to check white, I feel like it reduces me to a certain set of expectations or experiences that don't capture what it's meant to be an Arab and a Muslim in America," unquote. And his skin is pretty fair, so I can understand how someone might look at him and presume that he's white, but he doesn't identify that way. You see why this is so interesting and so powerful to me? I think that this could be really a wonderful opportunity for people to sort of crack open these expectations and make them make sense in a very different way. So I think this is great. There are a few critiques of this shift that I saw. I want to show you one that I don't really agree with, and then one that I think that might have a little bit of merit. One of the ones that I did not particularly dig comes from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank based in Washington. And I'm not hating on them because they're libertarian or because they're the Cato Institute. There are plenty of people from Cato who make very cogent arguments. They did put out a policy paper back last September called "The Consequences of a Middle Eastern or North African Survey Question." So they're not dealing with the totality of the census evolution with Hispanic or Latino and this new MENA character, a category rather. They're just dealing with the Middle Eastern or North African piece. Within this piece, one of the arguments they make has to do with basically the possibility that this reclassification could lock people of these ethnic and racial descents out of some of the programs like affirmative action or programs that are meant to fight discrimination, that it would impact these folks in ways that may be disadvantageous to them. They cite the ruling from the Supreme Court in SFFA versus Harvard, which is that ruling that went after Harvard and the University of North Carolina about their race-conscious admissions policies. I don't know why I can't talk. I'm getting sloppy in my old age. Here is part of what the Cato Institute wrote. I'm going to take a sip of water, and then I'm going to tell you what they wrote. Stand by. Refreshing. The Cato Institute policy piece on this reads in part, quote, "To the extent that discrimination against Asians persists in university admissions in the wake of SFFA versus Harvard, MENA applicants would also be discriminated against if they are lumped into a new racial category that exposes their high average academic success. Affirmative action will not harm MENA applicants in university admissions as much as it would harm Asian applicants, but it would penalize them more than it does white applicants." And then further down, "If a future Supreme Court overturned SFFA versus Harvard and again allowed universities receiving government funds to practice affirmative action, MENA Americans would be penalized. That may seem to be a remote possibility, but many supporters of a federally recognized right to abortion thought they were on solid ground before Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization overturned Roe versus Wade. No matter what, Americans who would fit into the proposed MENA classification would be harmed in university admissions, especially if SFFA versus Harvard is ever overturned. The prospect that a new racial category for MENA Americans would facilitate discrimination against their constituents ought to give pause to groups currently supporting the change in racial classification," unquote. Pause right there. What are they saying? They're saying that because people who are currently in this broad college of categories tend to do pretty well academically, if they are classified further as a discrete racial group, and the data show that that discrete racial group does well academically, then they might find themselves locked out of race-conscious programs in a certain degree, in the same way that Asian students who sued Harvard and USC, as UNC, argued that they had been discriminated against for doing too well, essentially, to benefit from these programs. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I fully buy this. First of all, we should be clear, there is a bit of a red herring in here. Did you notice how the Cato Institute wrote it, their piece? It postulated if a future Supreme Court overturned SFFA versus Harvard and again allowed universities receiving government funds to practice affirmative action. Affirmative action. That is not what that ruling was about. Affirmative action was already overturned in Bakke versus California. That ruling, SFFA versus Harvard, was about race-conscious admissions. Those are two different things. And I think using that term, affirmative action, conflates the variety of ways in which higher education can consider someone's background in making an admissions decision. By the way, there's a larger issue here, and feel free to be mad at me for this, and I'll take the hit for it. You are not entitled to get into Harvard. Sorry, smart kid, whatever color you are. Harvard is not your birthright. Sorry. So you didn't get into Harvard. Does that mean they were racist? What? I didn't get into Harvard. I got into the University of Miami, and I did just fine. You're not entitled to go to the school of your choice. You apply, you try for it. They make all kinds of goofy decisions that have nothing to do with your academics, and then you move on with your freaking life. Why is it such a big deal that you cannot get into the elite school of your dreams, and then all of a sudden your whole family feels like, we're taking you to court? I find that goofy. I just don't. Maybe if I heard it from the people who were involved, I would understand why it was so vital to them. And I'm not talking about legacy admissions. That's another issue that some universities are actually doing away with. That's another piece of this. But the idea that you would not brace your kids for the possibility that they would not get in, or worse, that you as a parent would not brace yourself for the possibility that your kid might not get in, and that is not a reflection on the quality of your parentage, I find that highly worrisome. I find that problematic for more reasons than race. That's a problem of your relationship with yourself. That's an issue of integrity. That's an issue of self-esteem and self-worth. And I cannot, for the life of me, understand why anyone would let something like that send them into a tailspin such that they would drag an entire university to court. That's weak tea. That's real weak tea. Anyway, there is another argument, however, that I saw that I think could be interesting, that might actually have some merit. This is from a piece that came out of the University of Texas at Austin. Census Bureau's proposal threatens integrity of race and ethnicity data by Ricardo Enrique Lowe Jr. It's a column that appeared in their publication back in December. And I think he does make at least one kind of interesting point near the end of the piece. Let me share with you what he had to say. And because I'm still not sure if I can really read, I'm going to take another sip of water just for my own sake. Hold on. Refreshing. His piece reads in part, quote, the Bureau, the Census Bureau, the Bureau claims these changes are due to methodological improvements to the separate race and ethnicity questions that effectively borrowed features from the combined question. These so-called improvements, however, involve coding logics that reassign people's responses involuntarily. For example, those who wrote South African in the white write-in line were recoded as both black and white because the Bureau considers South African to be indicative of a black place of origin, despite the fact that most South Africans in the US are white. Similarly, if a person of Hispanic or Latino origin, such as myself, writes Panamanian under the black category, the Bureau would auto-code that response as black and some other race. This is a big deal. Recoding people who identify as monoracial into a multiracial category results in undercounts and nullifies our ability to accurately assess racial disparities. Additionally, the involuntary reclassification of a race response can be interpreted as a violation of respondent self-identification. The US Census Bureau needs to take these concerns seriously. Statistical standards for race and ethnicity have been reviewed only twice during the past 50 years, which means that whatever decision is made about the combined question probably will be with us for the next several decades." Unquote. I think that's a compelling argument. I think that's interesting. Now, I don't necessarily see that as a fatal argument to the reclassification. Maybe that's a training and a skills question. But I do find that interesting in terms of whether or not people are going to be able to be classified as they see themselves and not, as the author notes, auto-coded into something that bears no resemblance to them. I think the South Africa example is a really good one. If you are South African in America, you may not well look black. You may look more Afrikaner. I think that's something that needs to be illuminated. Now, if you are white South African, you speak Afrikaans, right? And you have that white South African accent, you should be able to code yourself both as white and African and make that very clear in the results. As opposed to if you are a black South African and I always hear Nelson Mandela in my head as I'm trying to do the imitation. But you should be able to clarify that in the paperwork so that if you are white and you are a white South African, you can write white and then underneath it, South African Afrikaner, and you should be coded correctly. But I think what he's getting at, and please don't send me angry mail over those impersonations. I'm just trying to be friendly. I think that what he's getting at is a reasonable concern that perhaps in the training for the census or in the conversations about how we take the census needs to be discussed in a useful way. So I think that's a useful critique. Before I give up the census question, a few things that you should keep an eye out for. Number one, the Census Bureau is considering ways to get better data on who is LGBTQ+ in the United States. This is something that Hansi-Lo Wong talked about on NPR late last year. This has to do with some experimental forms for the American Community Survey, which is an additional series of surveys that are done by the Census Bureau that are different from the decennial census, that once-a-decade census. If you are offered the American Community Survey, you should still take it. It's still the Census Bureau. It's not a scam. It is actually useful data. Apparently, the plan is to put some test questions to people who are 15 years old, 15 years old, and older, and to try to see how people would answer questions about sexual orientation and gender identity. Again, for the same statistical reasons that we take census data, whether it's for knowing about discrimination or allocating funds and resources, it's kind of the same set of issues. Will people answer the question? And if so, how so? There's another proposal that we learned about last month from the Census Bureau that is going away, which would change the way the Census Bureau asks people about their disability status. I found this kind of interesting. And the issue was that the change in the question could dramatically reduce the number of people who show up as being disabled at all. Here's the thing. American Community Survey currently asks people whether they have, quote, serious difficulty with hearing, seeing, concentrating, walking, other functional abilities. Yes or no. There is a different international standard that asks in more detail that would ask people to rate their level of difficulty with certain activities, not just yes or no. The proposal was to ask people, do you have a lot of difficulty or cannot do it all or some difficulty? But here's the thing. The Census Bureau was proposing that when it counts who is disabled, it would count people who mentioned a lot of difficulty or cannot do it all. If you mention you have some difficulty, you would not count as disabled. That, according to the Bureau's own testing, could have lowered the share of the US population that is acknowledged as disabled by about 40%. Right now, it's about 14% of Americans identify as disabled. This shift would make it more like 8. And so obviously disability advocates were like, freeze, we're not doing that. So that proposal is out. Now, whether or not they'll still make the shift in the question to include people who say some difficulty, that may yet come in the future. Who knows? But that proposal, at least for now, is not going to happen. Also, one last thing, and then I will let this topic go and we'll move on. The other thing you should note is that there are some states that are changing the way they report data on race and ethnicity within their states, including this state right here, the state of Nevada. As it turns out, as of this year, here in Nevada, there is a new state law that will change the way that Middle Eastern and North African people are identified. There'll be a new subcategory. There was a new state law that passed January 1st, requires all government agencies here in the state of Nevada to include Middle Eastern and North African. That was put forward by Assemblywoman Brittany Miller, who is a Democrat. She represents the Vegas area. She put that proposal forward last year. Her father is black, her mother is Lebanese, and it passed with bipartisan support. Now, again, this is that whole issue of people who are Lebanese being listed as white, along with people who are Syrian, Jordanian, Palestinian, Egyptian. In other words, light-skinned Middle Eastern, right? That's basically the upshot of it. And what this does is it also breaks out some of that kind of skin color presumption, prejudice thing that is really not helpful at all. Also worth noting that lawmakers in Hawaii, Illinois, and Massachusetts, in addition to Nevada, all passed laws last year to collect their race and ethnicity data more granularly than the old categories that the federal government put in place back in 1977, that previous version of the census that has since been getting updated. So you might see this in state data as well as in federal data. There is a growing effort to try to make all of these different things conform. By the way, not sure if you're interested, but according to census data, about 17,000 Arabs live in the state of Nevada. That's up about 42% in the last 2 decades. So Nevada, you hear a lot about the Arab population in Michigan, for example, which is considerable in the Dearborn area. That would make Nevada's Arab population one of the fastest growing in the country here in the state. Granted, Nevada is one of the fastest growing states in the country, so I'm not surprised by that. People just they want to be here. But it's kind of nice to have a clearer picture of who's where. And I think it will be great, particularly for people who have been so lumped in and never had a category to themselves, to be able to be seen in a fuller, more respectful light. I think that makes a lot of sense. Let's pause one more time. I'm going to answer one more of your AMA questions before we go, and then I want to get back to this beauty right here. Again, apologies if you're listening to the podcast, but I will put a link in the description of the podcast to what I'm talking about, and you'll find out in the next segment what this thing is. But if you can't see it because you're listening to the podcast, you got to take a look at this thing. I think this is very cool, and I will tell you about what this is before we go. Welcome back. Let me dive back into the chat before we keep going. I did see some of your other comments. Solange the First, I see your comment. Solange writes, I remember Betty White on SNL doing an NPR send-up on muffins. That was so funny. Oh my God. Betty White is one of the people who I wish I had gotten a chance to interview before she passed. I found that so good. It was so funny. So funny. Jean, I see your comment on Facebook. Jean writes, my sister loves CNN. Good. I think there's a lot about CNN to love. I think there's a lot about CNN to criticize. Criticizing CNN seems to be everybody's favorite sport. I think what CNN would want to do is talk to someone like your sister and ask things like, if CNN went off the air tonight, what would you miss the most tomorrow? If we went off the air tonight, what would you miss the most tomorrow? And just see what she said. I also think that a lot of the networks, and this is why I had hoped that I'd have more of a future there, but apparently not. I was hoping that a lot more of the networks would understand that the thing that makes cable news networks successful, especially cable news networks, is not the news, right? Everyone likes to get all rhapsodic and get all back in my day about, the late, great Bernard Shaw when he was paired with Judy Woodruff and, Wolf Blitzer and all of these fine journalists who knew what news really was. You know what the number one show was on CNN for a long time? Larry King Live, a talk show where Jack Hanna's coming by tonight with his animals and those will be a lot of fun. And he would just take call, Trenton, New Jersey, hello. That was the top show on CNN, not the news. Top show on Fox News for all of his run, The O'Reilly Factor with Bill O'Reilly. Definitely not a news program. Top show on MSNBC, The Rachel Maddow Show, where she experimented with doing a 20-minute segment, which you don't do in news. But that's what makes it successful. And that's why I lost complete patience with these networks. I'm like, you guys are basically dumbing yourselves down. And you know your history. You know people like to watch the different thing. They don't like to watch the same old thing, right? It's the thing that's not news, that does something else. You give us the news, and at the end of the day, people, okay, what else you got? If you can't answer that what else you got question, you're screwed. You're not going to have a future. And a lot of them don't really answer that well. Now, the exception to that, I think, is a lot of the new streaming channels. Like NBC News Now, they've done very well for the space that they occupy in doing news all day long. So they're much more of news as a service, as a kind of a rolling service that you tune in at any time of the day and you'll get straight ahead news whenever you want it. And I think it does that really rather well. MSNBC is quite different. It appeals to a different kind of audience, but NBC News Now, the CBS News streaming network, ABC News Live, which, by the way, that's the worst name for a streaming network. CBS News streaming network. Call it something. Anyway, that's more what they're there to do, is just news. But eventually, what else you got? They're gonna have to give us a little bit more. Let me get to that other AMA question that I was asked, and then I will tell you more about that picture before I let you go. Pam asked 2 questions, one fun, one serious. Number 1, what is your favorite comfort food? The one that no one makes like mom. I'm going to take that one first, then I'll come back to the other one. My favorite comfort, I do not have a favorite comfort food. My mother makes a mean chocolate cake that I absolutely adore. She can fry chicken. Maybe that's it. Whatever my mother makes is comforting. I think that's the point, because my mama made it. And so I can sit there, eat and say, thank you, mama. She said, anything else? No, I'm fine. Thank you. This feels very nice. It's warm and delicious. So whatever she makes is my comfort food. So I'm not sure I have one. There are certain foods that I eat on, if I just want something simple. Like the other night after yesterday's show, when I was ranting and raving like a lunatic, I went out to an Italian restaurant here in Vegas, right near where I live, and I just got a chicken parmigiano because that's like my version of Italian comfort food is absolutely chicken parm. And it was delicious. It was over the top wonderful. Got dessert. I got a spumoni bomba, which is basically spumoni ice cream, the cherry pistachio and dark chocolate ice cream in a sphere of dark chocolate drizzled with some kind of deliciousness on the outside that's cracked open into 4 pieces. So it's kind of like a solid ice cream dessert. And that cured everything. I'm at a nobody. That will hold me for at least 36 hours of feeling good about the world. So for me, it's not necessarily what mom makes. It's just kind of, there's a few kind of staples that I really enjoy that help me kind of like come down when I'm going, those things are healing. I think some people would live a much better life if they just let themselves have a cupcake. Like you don't need to scream at your coworker. You don't need to scream. You need Krispy Kreme. You understand what I'm saying? Just go have something sugary and delicious once, presuming that your health can endure it. I'm not saying go eat Krispy Kreme if you got diabetes, but if you can have it, maybe you just need something yummy to make yourself feel better. Budget for that so that every now and then you can be like, screw it. I'm not making dinner. I'm going to this restaurant's called Spaghetti Western in Las Vegas. It's way off the strip. Spaghetti with a Y. Spaghetti Western. Local place. Not open late. They close at 9 p.m. every night. But they are the answer for Italian food. They are fantastic. So that saved my life yesterday. Second part of Pam's question. Pam asks, the bottom line is warm wishes don't pay the rent. What will it take to enable you to keep going? How many annual members or average tips, etc.? I'm not trying to be nosy or overstep. I just appreciate what you do so much and I want to be sure you can continue. If I tried to monetize the value I receive from the Nightlight and its community, I certainly could not afford the membership. As an accountant, I want concise numbers, but on an online forum, more vague answers may have to suffice. Pam, I appreciate the question. I will put it to you this way. Right now, all I need to do is pay my bills. That's the beauty of having a startup is all I need to do is be able to pay what it costs to live in Las Vegas for the rest of the year. Now, you can imagine what it costs to live in a mid-sized city, in a 2-bedroom apartment with my partner, of course, driving my car around town, putting gas in the tank. You can see what gas costs here in Las Vegas. Go to the AAA fuel gauge and you can see what it costs here. Paying for insurance and food and incidentals and accidentals and all that kind of stuff, health insurance and whatnot. It's basically just being able to pay to live here and then figuring out how to make good on the ambitions I have by building this program and making it as great as possible so that I can then go on and say, hey, look at this thing I built. The other factor is I don't think that this year anything is going to move. 2024 is going to be looked back on as a year when the media as an industry lost its freaking mind. Like all of these companies are in a really weird place right now. Comcast had been riding super ultra high. It's doing rather well. The Universal theme parks are expanding, but then there was this nonsense with Ronna Romney McDaniel that's going on. And Comcast's bosses do not like drama. They can deal with uncertainty. They're built for challenges. They don't like drama. Comcast prides itself on being a stable, largely family-controlled company. Brian Roberts is the son of Ralph Roberts, who founded Comcast. He's the chairman. So they're in a weird place. Paramount Global, the parent company, was just downgraded to junk status. They look like they're about to get bought for a few $billion. And they may not be bought entirely. Paramount owns CBS. It's possible that just the Paramount movie TV studio could get bought and CBS could be dangling in another direction. Walt Disney faces this proxy fight among a major shareholder named Nelson Peltz, who the company is openly criticizing. I'll show you more about that in the weeks to come because I think that's a fight you should be paying attention to, not just because of all the corporate, whatever, but like it's wild. So that's happening. Warner Brothers Discovery is buried in debt right now. The guy who bought it, David Zaslav, who co-founded Discovery and took it over with the help of Wall Street, is tens of billions of dollars upside down. Paying it off, but it's a bit of a mess. It's a bit of a mess. So no one's coming right now. The cavalry is not coming. And for me to be able to put together a business plan in this environment is nuts. Plan for what? I can tell you what I'd like to do. I can tell you what my dream is with this show. But in terms of how much it'll cost, what it would take, I don't know that there's any way to really know that unless we're talking about what it would cost for me to do it by myself with no corporate help, maybe here in Las Vegas or out in LA, which is probably where I will end up, back in California. But I really don't know. That's hard to say. Right now, I just need to pay rent and keep my belly full and make sure that I can sort of get by from day to day. Although, I will give you this, I am almost fully monetized on YouTube. The way it works is at a certain level, you can sell memberships on YouTube. You can sell merch on YouTube. So if you go to my YouTube page, you can go buy merch. It'll link you straight through there. At the next level, YouTube will put ads in your video and you get a cut of the ad revenue. And I am this close to being fully monetized on YouTube. So that'll eventually begin to bring in more revenue. And I'm working on how to improve the way I produce these so that I can crank them out a little differently. Might affect the live show schedule, fair warning, but it'll at least allow me to monetize in a different way. So there are different options. I sometimes wonder, like, if I had never gone the network route and I had just come to YouTube, how much richer would I be right now? Like, would I be doing it right now? Would this be enough money to call it a business right now? What would that look like? Water under the bridge. I at least come to this with a different skill set, which is nice. But it's hard to know. It's really hard to know. Oh, Dark Forever Clear, I see your comment. Dark Forever Clear wrote, I did buy a Nightlight hoodie and a mug on your birthday. I'll be a billboard for you. Bless you. Oh, I see you wrote, I need a decal for my car. Working on that. I am working on that. The vendor that I work with offers all kinds of merch, and so I am working on that as well. Joseph, I see your comment on YouTube. Joseph writes, there's so much terrific under-the-radar locals food in Las Vegas from all over the world. Thanks for giving me a new place to check out. You're very welcome. You're absolutely right. There's so much food here. There is a diner in downtown. Oh, God, something in Ethel's? Hang on a second. I'll find it. Give me a second. Is it Winnie and... Yes. Winnie and Ethel's Diner. Winnie, W-I-N-N-I-E, and Ethel. Winnie and Ethel's Downtown Diner. That's it. That was just recommended to me here. Winnie and Ethel's Downtown Diner here in Las Vegas. That was recommended to me, so I'm going to go check that out. And then, drive up and down Spring Mountain Road. Vegas has a gigantic Chinatown. Again, not near the Strip. You need to drive there. But there's too much good food here. There's way too much good food here. Anyway, one last thing and then I will let you go for the night. This is me working on trying to make the show tighter so that it is easier to put online. It's the real challenge. I wanted to show you this image again. And again, for those of you listening to the podcast, I'll put a link in the description so you can see what we're talking about. This image, what do you think this is? I know some of you put your guess into the chat, and some of your guesses were not, some of them were not bad. I think, let me go back through the chat and see who it was that actually might have gotten the guess right. Let's see. Pam guessed that it was a black hole. Humanity also guessed that it was a black hole. And you are kind of correct. It's not exactly a black hole per se. It is a unique depiction of the shape of the black hole, or more specifically, the shape of the energies around the black hole. This is a new image of a gigantic black hole at the center of the galaxy, a literal supermassive black hole that shows the magnetic field around the black hole. Essentially, I won't get too complicated in the science of all this, but basically this is an image of a black hole known as Sagittarius A star, which is at the edge, which is the black hole in the center of the galaxy, in the center of the Milky Way galaxy. The European Southern Observatory dropped this picture just yesterday, explaining what the image was. This was taken by a telescope called the Event Horizon Telescope. And what it shows is a few things. Number one, the reason it has those beautiful streaks of light, this looks like a corporate logo somewhere, but it's nature, and I think it is so gorgeous, is because they took this image in polarized light. And because the light is polarized around this, it shows how the magnetic forces around a black hole move, how they bend energy and move things around. So this gives us a much better sense of the shape and of the action of a black hole. Now, they'd already taken the previous picture of this same black hole, and it was not nearly as cute. This is what the first picture looked like. It was a little fuzzy. It was a little drunk. It was a little, it looked a little funny. They were able to get this one by using polarizing light. The nice thing that they found is that it's also similar to another black hole called M87, which is not nearly as big. But if you look at the two pictures of M87, the smaller black hole, and Sagittarius A star, which is this real big one, side by side, you see there are similarities in the way that it bends and pulls light energy around it. And what this gives us is a little more information about how black holes work and about what black holes do. This is one of those kind of core questions in terms of understanding the universe and dark matter and the kinds of energy that jets and flows around a black hole. I also find that these pictures are sort of incredible, just to be able to look at the Milky Way. Here's another image that this same telescope took of the center of the Milky Way. All of this is online. The European Southern Observatory, it's eso.org. All of these images are online, and I think that this is one of the more fascinating scientific phenomena to me. I think that when life on Earth seems absolutely bananas, it's kind of nice to be able to look up into space and see something else and just get a little perspective that the universe is not the size of our problems, that the universe is a little bit more reasonable than we are here, and that there are forces bigger than politics, there are forces bigger than race, there are forces bigger than discrimination, and there are forces bigger than bigotry out in the universe. There are some amazing cosmic things happening way beyond us that still are way beyond us. They still defy our understanding. Personally, I take comfort in that. I like the fact that there's still more to know and more to explore, and that this, all of this insanity, that this is not the end of it. That's the Star Trek nerd in me, but that gives me a little hope. Shannon, I see your comment on YouTube. Shannon wrote, of course Sagittarius is the center of the galaxy. Or universe. Sorry, making fun of my husband. Ha ha. I like that. See, you can use this with him now. Don't let him see it, though. Don't let him know there's a Sagittarius in the center of the galaxy, because then you're going to have to deal with him in a very different way. And I don't know what'll happen, but you might end up wanting to throw him into a black hole. Hopefully that won't happen. We'll see if we can keep that from happening. Hey, I appreciate you making time for me today. Come on back tomorrow. Remember, you can find all of my links online at nightlightjoshua.com. Be sure to email me any questions, thoughts, critiques, compliments, or ideas you might have. Joshua@nightlightshow.com. I hope you come on back for tomorrow's program at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'll have more information about upcoming shows then. But until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you, as always, for making time for me. Enjoy the rest of your night, and please, my friends, wherever you are in the universe, keep shining. Someone needs your light right now.